welcome to our presentation. I'm Ben Bush, Assistant Professor of Industrial Design at Auburn University.
And I'm Dr. Anna Ruth Gatlin, Assistant Professor of Interior Design at Auburn University. Welcome.
Welcome. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about some research that we've been doing.
It's on studio critiques. We both study studio culture, and a key component to any type of design studio culture is the idea of studio critiques. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what design culture is.
Yes.
How would you describe what you do in your day-to-day job?
Great question. We believe that design in itself is a problem-solving endeavor. Now, the different directions you can take with design dictates whether you're in interior, graphic, industrial. With industrial design, we are typically concerned with mass goods, solving problems, providing utility both to an end user but also a producer.
And in interior design, we're really concerned with the user's experience of the space. So I teach commercial interior design, which is office design. And so my end user would be not just the corporation that we're designing for, but also the people who have to work in that space. So again, design is problem solving in interiors or in industrial design.
Which brings us to our next component.
So in studio classes, there's a lot of this give and take between the student and the professor, where the professor or the teacher is providing input on the work that the student or the learner has accomplished.
Right. Very important that there has to be work to discuss. It's a very reciprocal sport, if you say so yourself, and I do. So in order to have this conversation, you have all this foundational learning, typically in a first year or second year, a common vocabulary. Then there's a design brief, and there's some type of research. And once you have these fundamental elements, you can have a design discussion about how identifying a area of investigation, how you're identifying possible opportunities in a market, and then how you're trying to solve those problems using the design theory, using the design methodology.
So typically the student will take all of the research that they've done independently or as a group, and then they will need to apply it in some way. And that could be via hand sketches, it could be something that they generate on the computer, but the big thing is that they have done something, because you can't critique a blank piece of paper. So the studio professor will engage with students typically individually, because a lot of the components of the project are individual, and the student will have to explain what they have done, and the professor will have to assimilate what has been done, kind of couch it in their head as to what they need to be responding back to, and then they have to formulate that in words and design ideas that the student will understand. So there's a lot that's happening in the brain of the studio professor at this time, because they're having to assess where the student is, where the student can feasibly go with this critique, and how to explain that, all in about 10 minutes, because you've got a lot of students.
Right. Which brings us to the topic that we've researched. Is it essentially ethical to take them away from one student and give it to another?
You have a constrained amount of time in a studio setting. Your students don't have all day to be in the studio setting with you, and you don't have all day to be in there with them. You have other classes that you have to teach. They have other classes they have to take. So you have this time parameter and X number of students to critique in that time parameter. So the key thing that we're exploring is it ethical to take a portion of some other student's time that you have allocated to them and use that time to critique a student who might need more help because they come from a different background or they haven't had the same classes that some other person has had. So a key component that we realized as we were talking about the ethics of studio critique is that there could be a critical race theory component to this. You may have noticed that we are both Caucasian individuals, and we are both design educators, but we both come from a background where we didn't have formalized art education. And there are marginalized populations who also do not have a design or art background in high school or whatever. And so a question that we started thinking about was, is it more ethical to spend more time with these marginalized populations who may not have the design background, or is it more ethical to divide the time consistently across all of the students in the studio?
This isn't necessarily a difference between public school and private school.
No.
I can only speak from public school, what I experienced. But for many of the school systems in Alabama, the tax revenue from the county, from the state, from the city goes and benefits the educational system. So a school in Birmingham, Madison County, Elmore County would not benefit from taxes from Lee County.
Right. So a question that we wanted to also think about was, how do people without power validate their ideas? Because some cultures have a history of their voices not being heard, or a history of their particular cultural aesthetic being not in good taste. So how do we, as the design professors, make sure that we are not reinforcing those types of stereotype during our critique, where we're encouraging the student to try something different or push something further or completely change their entire approach? A couple of things that we wanted to make sure that we were addressing are the ideas of institutionalized racism, which is something that Camera Phyllis-Jones has explored tremendously, and then the idea of this internalized racism, where there's an unconscious bias towards a culture or cultural motifs or design approaches or whatever, and that's Karen Pike. That is really the big name that we've looked at in internalized racism. Would love to, in a future presentation, talk a little bit more about some frameworks of design critiquing, including O's framework of design critique and Daniels and Martin's. But really, these are organized around the idea that design critique should be free from judgment and aggression, because you don't want to alienate the person who is hearing this feedback, this critique, because oftentimes it's not positive. It's
critical.
Critical, yeah.
So, not a disagreement,
yes.
But article by Margaret Conkle. She references Kolb 1984, that learning by its very nature is a tension and conflict-filled process. So, with all things in design, there's typically a bit of ambiguity that must be navigated.
So again, we're critiquing students one after another very intensely. We're trying to formulate feedback that's based on the deliverable that they have produced, and we're trying to be as equitable as possible and not be too hard on a student but not too soft on another student. And so using that critical theory of ensuring that we are being as moral with our critique as possible, so that we are not being too harsh or too lenient, but understanding that some people come from different backgrounds, and so they might need extra work or extra help or guidance to a certain point.
Right, and that speaks to their formative or developmental values that they brought into the studio. We're also trying to instill design values. Mm-hmm. One of the values is we need to communicate effectively. So even though we have different scales to offer our concepts by, if you bring me a drawing, we can have a discussion. If you bring me a three-dimensional model, we can have a greater discussion. So it's not so much on what they want to talk about or their values, which are also very important. It's more so, can we have a conversation about what you brought, identify intent, identify values, and identify ways you can progress their concept.
And to do that, they have to be able to discuss what they did. And there's really two types of critiques that we're talking about. In a design studio, you will typically have formative critiques that happen at intervals throughout the design studio semester. And then usually at the end, you will have a design jury of professionals who come into the studio to do a summative critique, which is a critique of the whole body of work that they have produced over this whole semester.
Right. So now in this section, we want to briefly discuss some of our personal experience with design critique in our studios.
So I have taught first year up until this past year, and then I also teach third year. So in first year design critiques, you're really laying a foundation. You're talking about the elements and principles of design, and you're talking about things that might seem obvious and almost feel too basic, but the students really need to build that foundation so that you can push them further as they get further into the program.
Right. And we don't have necessarily a first-year program. We have a first-year pre-industrial design course, which exposes them to what design is, design as a whole, but more specifically what industrial design might look like. Mm-hmm. Then when they get in their second year, their sophomore class, we're combining design skills, which takes a huge amount of unlearning. The high school systems that we typically get students from don't have these type of conversations. Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking about rhythm or balance or proportion or scale, These are new words to them, so it's very difficult. And for this reason, the complexity, we start a lot in two-dimensional design, and then we graduate into three-dimensional design. Typically, the second year course deals with simplified versions of product design, really focusing on design vocabulary, starting to critique. And in terms of how the critique goes in those scenarios, we try to block out. We have a 15-to-1 ratio for this reason. We try to block out enough time for these conversations because they don't know how to critique yet. They haven't been exposed to it. Referencing an earlier point, you typically learn from 3 places: previous experiences, your peers, upperclassmen, lowerclassmen, or the teacher themselves. So the teacher has to play a very informative role. Our curriculum is a bit special in the fact that we have a triple talk class, 45 students, 3 professors.
Wow.
We want to expose them to the ambiguity of design because the way I interpret a given scenario or a composition will be different than my colleague does.
Right.
So we're giving them multiple perspectives, not so much because we think our way is the right way. We're actually openly admitting that you're going to have multiple perspectives and you need to decide for yourself what values or ethics or approaches you're going to take.
Right. Well, with us in the third year, we're really exploring more fully the human's experience with the design. So they've already established their elements and principles, the rhythm, balance, all of that. They've got a good technological footing. They have construction documents figured out for the most part. So we're really trying to make them empathize with the user, who is going to actually use the space, and how do you make these decisions that support that while also supporting the end user's financial needs and things like that, because there is always a budget that you have to work with. So really pushing them to think more beyond themselves and what they like, and pushing them to get into the mind and using of the user.
Very good. And I occasionally get the opportunity to teach 4th year, which is radically different than anything else. Typically, we have a sponsored project. A client comes in and gives us a real-world design problem. It's a fantastic opportunity for our students. But it does mean the critiques are more personal. Earlier on, you're driving home a couple of different foundational design terms and approaches. At this point, you're more honing where a certain designer how should they pitch this, what type of personal influences, where they need to go back and do research. They're a lot more autonomous. And the only way these studios work at a high level is if every single set of instruction beforehand has been done at an excellent level. They're a fully filled out designer. If there's any gaps at the 4th year level, you have to make a very difficult judgment call. Do you just kind of patch and move on, or do you stop the progress of everyone to kind of reorientate and re-educate?
Yeah, do you no child left behind it, or do you just move on?
It's difficult, especially when you throw in the fact that we have a client who's paid for this opportunity. They want output. We need to deliver on them.
You need to deliver lots of output.
Yeah, it's almost like I quit being a design educator and I'm more a design manager in those situations, which happens to fill in gaps occasionally.
Yeah, we have some sponsored opportunities as well in the third year, and so they are having to empathize with people that they've never met, with factory workers or with people who work in offices. And so it's a true thing. Like, do you go at the pace of the slowest person, or do you go at the pace that it should go at so that you can get the project done, and most of it done excellently? It's a question.
Right. So in conclusion, I want to see if we can articulate a little bit about, is it ethical to spend more time on a student than another student? What are your opinions?
I think that sometimes you have to.
Right.
I think that especially if it's a sponsored client like that, then it does no one any good to deliver something that's terrible.
Right.
But I think you have to measure the amount of time that you use with that student and realize when it's enough.
Right.
And when you've reached that tipping point of you can't offer more unless you offer a whole lot more, and that might be at the expense of everyone else.
Right.
What do you think?
My thoughts are kind of twofold. The first is, at what year level are you? If it's at a younger level, in order to do ethically right thing, you're going to have to go into your own bank of time, the time that you're not getting paid for or compensated for.
Right.
And instead of doing your schoolwork at school, you do schoolwork at home. So if the extra students who need the feedback get the feedback.
Yeah.
Because you realize if you have a deficit here and you ignore it, everyone's going to suffer all the way up.
Right.
So biting the bullet and making sure they have feedback. The second component to that is, how much work did they bring in? If you bring in models and you bring me experience, even if it's not successful, if you're bringing in content, I want to have conversations
You
with you.
did something.
Right.
You are putting in the effort, and therefore I will put in the effort.
Yes.
But if you bring in that blank sheet of paper and you've done nothing, or you've drawn
Or you
a
say,
line,
I have these ideas.
but you don't have anything to show
Right.
of your ideas,
I have an idea. Let's make it purple.
then that tells
It's a
me
terrible idea.
a lot about who you are as a human and whether or not me putting effort into you is
Right.
going to pay off in any way for your learning.
Yes. Great comments.
You too. That was an episode of Among a Duo of Houseplants.
Pretty good.
Made that up.
That was good.
Thanks.
Kind of legitimate.